Of all the fatal injuries in the United States, accidents are by far the most common. When people do take a life, it is most often their own. But for many people, violence is far more frightening because we have so little control over others' intentions and actions. We tend to see violence as deviant behavior, but like all deviance, it depends on how we label it. Authoritarian countries and many of our own states have capital punishment, allowing the government to take lives of certain criminals, while a vigilante act of individual revenge would be condemned as murder. States may also commit larger acts of violence against other countries or groups, which we call war, or more recently in our history, military action. Non-state groups may commit their own acts of mass violence in the name of their own beliefs or political goals, what we call terrorism. Some social scientists see large-scale violence between states as a thing of the past, as new economies and governments provide widespread comfort and freedom to individuals, and interdependence between states. Others say that wars between political nations will be replaced by conflict between different major cultural groups. The process of McDonaldization is part of a larger trend that others label cultural imperialism, due to Western control of economics and the media. We've already seen backlash, sometimes violence, against cultural change in some regions. 2001 saw the largest single attack inside the United States since the Civil War, and it was carried out not by an army, but by a small group of individuals working outside of any one government, using violence as a political statement. Since then, the United States has led a coalition of other, mostly European countries in a global war on terror, including military actions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other countries thought to be aiding such groups. But terrorist organizations use resentment and desperation to influence individuals to join up, and political instability to gain coercive power, and their actions have only increased in the last 15 years. Yet, earlier in the 20th century, Europe had its own period of instability and violence, with 2 world wars giving way to several smaller terrorist movements seeking independence from what they saw as colonial domination. Terrorist groups formed amongst the Irish in the United Kingdom, the Basques in Spain, the Kosovoans in the former Yugoslavia, and others. The recent emergence of self-proclaimed Islamic State may seek larger goals, but they grew out of a similar history of post-colonialism. Despite particular regions that have become more violent of late, in general, violence in most industrial nations has actually been consistently decreasing. Despite an increase in civilian casualties as warfare moved from the battlefield to city streets in the total war of the 20th century, since 1945 most conflicts have been within smaller nations, although larger powers have often taken sides. Comparing modern data to archaeological evidence, we are actually living in perhaps the most peaceful period of human history. Despite a rise in violent crime in the 1970s and 80s, the chances of dying a violent death are actually relatively low. Yet, media coverage of violent crime is at its highest, perhaps because terrorism and murder are more frightening and more exciting than more common killers like cancer, accidents, and depression. But even if most individuals are less likely than ever to commit a murder, those that do have more power than ever before to commit mass murder with the help of guns, bombs, and other modern weapons. Punishing criminals doesn't help their victims, and stopping violent acts before they happen with coercive force requires increasing government power over individuals' privacy and freedom, with limited results at that. The same could be said for preventing access to those weapons. But are there other ways we could prevent the motivation behind such actions? Often, powerful countries try to decrease violence by building up their own defenses, or providing weapons to others in hopes that they will defend themselves. But does that simply add to the potential for mass violence? Are there other reasons for the buildup of weaponry? During the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, both countries adopted a policy of mutually assured destruction, in which both hoped to keep the other from attacking by showing the ability and will to annihilate the other. The U.S. has already shown its power by destroying the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan at the end of the Second World War, the only time nuclear weapons have yet been used to take human lives. Could a full-scale nuclear war lead to the extinction of the human race? Or are we facing a slower, less obvious danger? Not an acute communicable epidemic of violence, but more of a long-term, chronic threat brought on by our own lifestyles and social structures. In our final lesson, we'll explore the problems of environmental damage and the workings of social movements that use nonviolent means to solve them.